The 1980 El Salvadoran Civil War is a major shaping factor of current-day El Salvador. Starting in the 1970s, the oppressed people of El Salvador started to rise up and revolt against their government. Although many lives on both sides were lost during the war, the compromise that resulted in the peace accords ended over 20 years of oppression against the peasant workers within the country. Monday, March 24th, 1980. The people of San Salvador attend their weekday church services throughout the city. At the Church of Divine Providence, Archbishop Oscar Romero held a chalice over his head, praying to his God. As he was doing this, a car pulled up outside. Out stepped an unknown gunman who fired a single shot into the Archbishop's left breast. He collapsed to the ground, unable to breathe. He died shortly after due to his injuries. The Archbishop was no normal priest. He was the figurehead for a much larger movement than just the Catholic Church. Oscar Romero was a figurehead for the people's rights, and many perceived him as the figurehead of the 5 different anti-oppression groups within El Salvador. The people of El Salvador had been oppressed by a long line of military dictatorships. His death sparked the 12-year civil war that lasted until 1992, and remains in the heart of many citizens of El Salvador to this day. Oscar Romero's funeral took place on March 30th, 1980. Over 250,000 mourners attended in honor of the late Oscar Romero. Viewing this as a protest of the government, the military sent snipers to the roofs surrounding the basilica where the mass was held. 2/3 of the way through the sermon, a military bomb exploded in the center of the leftist group. The military had thrown the explosive device at them in an attempt to cause a panic and spread fear throughout the crowd. As soon as this happened, the basilica doors were rushed by fleeing, panicked patrons of the mass. 5,000 to 6,000 people entered the basilica. Reports say no one was able to move because of how packed it was. Oscar Romero's body was lowered into his tomb as gunfire and explosions sounded all around the basilica. After 3 hours inside, the priests, bishops, and nuns left the building to show it was safe to the civilians trapped inside. In the time leading up to the Civil War, the military-run government oppressed most of the population, whom were overworked and majorly underpaid. The people of El Salvador were forced to farm sugarcane, coffee, and cotton. They also had to collect fish for the 14 families who owned 99% of the wealth in the country and ran the government. Though it sounds like everyone would have had plenty of food based on what was collected, the 14 families who ran El Salvador took everything that was harvested and sold it to other countries. Most farms in the entire country were commercially run, leaving the peasants without the opportunity to feed themselves. The government's major adversary was the Farabundo Marti National Liberation Front. The Farabundo Marti National Liberation Front, or better known as the FMLN, was not formed until after Oscar Romero's death. His death triggered the Communist Party of El Salvador and 4 other major leftist revolutionary organizations to merge and form the FMLN. Due to the fear of communism spreading, the United States assisted the government of El Salvador despite their brute and forceful ways. The El Salvadoran government received more than $5 million in 1981 in order to stop the FMLN from taking over and ruling El Salvador. This decision was made by President Carter and was used to purchase weapons to fight with in the Civil War. The United States also provided $60 million in emergency aid after an earthquake struck San Salvador in 1986. The United States provided military support in the 1980s but pulled out their non-essential personnel during 1989 due to escalating fighting between the two sides. While never officially acknowledged by the government, pro-government death squads emerged to assist in the elimination of anti-government factions. If a group, family, or individual were to publicly denounce the government or show support of the FMLN, the death squad would torture and kill them. Throughout the Civil War, there were minimal battles between opposing forces, unlike what one would expect, but there were retaliations to every action committed by one side or the other. On December 2, 1980, 4 American nuns on a mission were kidnapped by El Salvadoran National Guardsmen in response to orders from a sergeant in the El Salvador military. These nuns were raped, beaten, and murdered. The FMLN considered this an attack on the people of El Salvador. They then retaliated by starting to attack military bases and checkpoints throughout El Salvador at any chance they got. Another major act of violence in the Civil War was the 1989 Jesuit massacre. On November 16, 1989, a death squad entered the campus of the Jesuit University of Central America. Their goal that day was to kill Father Ignacio Ellacuria and leave no witnesses behind who could tell the story of what happened there that day. Father Ignacio Ellacuria was an outspoken critic of the El Salvadoran military dictatorship. By the time the death squad had left that day, 6 priests had died, as well as a housekeeper and her daughter. This massacre left governments all over the world calling on the El Salvador government to start participating in peace talks with the FMLN. Over 20 different military officials participated in organizing the action on that day, and have all been accused of different crimes and extradited to Spain, where they have been imprisoned since. Throughout the Civil War, 40,000 civilians died and 40,000 military soldiers died. 70,000 others were tortured and punished for their beliefs. The compromise in El Salvador was the result of the United Nations proposing peace talks between the FMLN and the government. The Chapultepec Peace Accords were named after the neutral ground of Chapultepec Castle in Mexico, where the accords were signed. The accords were signed on January 16, 1992 by both parties. The Chapultepec Agreement concluded the peace process in El Salvador. The Comprehensive Peace Agreement dealt with the reform of the armed forces, civilian police, justice system, electoral system, economic and social arrangements, and land and property issues. The agreement also included provisions for the political participation of the FMLN and for a final ceasefire with the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of the armed groups. The ceasefire formally took effect on February 1, 1992, and was officially terminated on December 15, 1992, when the last elements of the FMLN military structure were demobilized. The Salvadoran armed forces had already reduced its size to about 50% of the 1991 level. The compromise had worked. Peace was official.